Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. I've got a project coming up that requires a couple of raised panel doors, so I thought this was the perfect opportunity to do a deep dive into raised panel doors and show you how to make some on your own router table at home. Alright, so before we can actually start cutting anything, we need to do a little bit of math. It's not hard math, it's just some stuff you have to keep in mind. First of all, the components of the door are the rail, are the horizontal pieces, and the stiles are the vertical pieces. Now the stiles, the math is super easy. It's just whatever your overall height of the door is, you're done. The rail is where it gets a little bit trickier, and here's the formula that gets you there, but we'll walk through that in a second. First of all, you have to figure out how big your door needs to be. Now here I've got a diagram of a face frame for a project I'm going to do coming up, and we're just going to work out the math on the doors, one of the doors for this. So over on the side here we have 20 1/4 by 11 is the opening in the face frame that we have to cover up. First of all, you have to know what the overhang of the hinges that you're going to use are. Now I'm going to use some soft close hidden hinges, and every one that I've run into is a 1/2 inch. You may run into other sizes out there, I don't really know, but in this case we're going with 1/2 inch. So you have to add a 1/2 inch to all four sides, or an inch to the length and an inch to the width. So this measurement ends up being 21 1/4 by 12. That's pretty simple. So this is the overall size of our door. That means our stiles are 21 1/4 inches long. We're done. So now we start working on the rail dimensions. Now we know that our overall width is going to be 12. We need to know what the width of our stiles is times 2, because there's one on each side. So we're subtracting the width of both of these from our 12. I'm making all of my components 2 inches wide. So that means we have 2 and 2 is 4. So we're going to subtract 4 inches. That means we have 8. Now we have to add back the width, the length, whatever you want to call it there, of your grooves. Inside of your rails here, there's going to end up being tongues that stick out into the stiles, and we have to add that distance back, otherwise your door is going to end up short. So my bit, the length of the groove, the depth of the groove, I don't really know how to call that, that ends up being 3/8 of an inch. You add that on both sides, 3/8 plus 3/8 is 3/4. So we have to add back 3/4. So that's simple enough. 8 3/4 is the length of our rails. Not too tricky. Now, we need to work out the math for the panel on the inside. The panel on the inside, because there's going to be groove the entire length of the stile that the panel has to slide into, we can just assume that the panel width is the same width as the rail that we just worked out. We'll come back to that, that's not the whole story. So now we pretty much have to work this same formula on the stiles to get the overall height of the panel. So we just take our 21 1/4 minus our 4 because of the 2 rails. So that's 17 1/4, and then we have to add back 3/4. So now we're up to 18 total inches for the height of our panel. So our panel is looking like 18 by 8 3/4. The one thing you have to include here is you need to think about wood movement if you don't want your doors to blow apart. So this measurement would fit us absolutely perfectly snug inside a door with these measurements. To keep it from blowing things apart, to keep your wood movement from causing problems, I like to just take about a 1/16 off. The grain in my door is going to run this way, so you normally wouldn't have to worry about it expanding this way. It's not a big deal. Just to make things easy on my brain, I'm going to subtract about a 1/16 from both of these, and that gives you enough slop to account for any wood movement inside that panel. So this covers the measurements. Now we can get into actually cutting components and start building these doors. I picked out a bunch of what I thought was nearly unusable maple from my lumber shed. It was borderline rotten on the outside, but once I jointed and planed it down to 3/4 inch thick, it turned out I had some solid boards with really nice looking spalting in it. I set the widest boards aside to use for the center panels, then I ripped everything else down to 2 inch wide for my rails, stiles, and for a face frame I'll be building in a future project. I cut off the unusable ends, but otherwise I left everything as long as I could for the first router table operation. Starting with the stile cutter bit, it gets locked into the router table and lowered into position. I like to use these setup blocks from Rockler to make sure I have the bit set to the exact right height. If you don't have one, you'll just have to guess, then make some test cuts and some scraps until you get the height dialed in so the top and bottom of your rails and stiles are flush with each other. Once you have it right, make sure to save one of your scraps to make setup easier the next time. Adjust your fence to be perfectly flush with the bearing on the bit. I like to use a straight edge and find the sweet spot where it just barely makes the bearing turn when you slide it back and forth. Next, set up your feather boards to keep some pressure pushing the workpieces down against the table and back against the fence. The feather boards aren't just a safety thing in this case. The consistent pressure also helps to get a uniform profile cut into all your workpieces. Once you've tested and confirmed that your bit height is correct, you can run all your rail and stile material through the table with the show side facing down. And there's not much else to say about this part of the process. If you have all of your setup done correctly, this is as easy as pushing a stick through a hole. But since I have a bunch of footage taken at various angles with some pleasing depth of field for an artistic feel, it seems like it would be a waste of good cinematography not to use it. I guess I'll just ramble on about nothing for a bit in order to justify leaving it in. Once the edge profile is cut into all of the pieces, you can start breaking them down to their final length. If you trust your math, then cut everything. If you want to double check first, just cut pieces for a single door so you can cut the tongues into the rail ends and dry fit a door together to measure. Trust me, you don't want to get all the way through the process only to find that all of your doors are a ½ inch too narrow. The setup on the rail bit is about the same, but in this case we're going to use a coping sled. You could get away without one, but once you dial the sled in, it makes it much easier and faster to cut a bunch of different parts. Put your setup block on the base of the coping sled and adjust your bit to match that height, and set your fence flush with the bearing, just as we did before. Slide your material through the sled and secure it against the onboard fence. It helps prevent tear out if you use a scrap piece as a backing block. Push the ends of your material flat up against the fence and push the sled close enough that the guide on the top can be adjusted to make contact. Making sure your material is still flat against the fence, slide the guide forward until it contacts the fence, then tighten it down. During operation, this long clear guide is the part that you will register against the fence. Your material down below will just go along for the ride. You can visually confirm your height by making sure the blades on the bit perfectly line up with the edges of the grooves you cut earlier. Clamp one of your scraps in place in the sled, then cut the tongue into the end of it. Once again, if everything is adjusted correctly, your material should be flush on the top and bottom. Now that everything is dialed in and you've checked that your math gave you the correct overall size, you can finish cutting and shaping all of the remaining components.
At this point I have all of my rails and stiles cut to length, all the joinery is done, and I've dry fit them together. I double checked that all of my dimensions are right and we're good to go there. So it's time to start working on the panels that go in the middle of it. Now we worked out in the math what the dimensions of these panels need to be, but you can double check that by just taking and measuring the inside of this frame, that the profile on that, the other bit cut in there for us. These will need to be exactly the same as this interior window. So just double checking here, I am within about a 1/16 of an inch of the math that I worked out earlier, which that slop that I built in for expansion and contraction takes care of that. So we're good to go here. Now it's time to start forming these. Now, this is what you think of when you hear raised panel router bit. This is kind of the traditional style. It is a big diameter, big, heavy chunk of metal. The setup for this is easier and the operation is easier, but it does take more horsepower. It does take a little bit larger router table setup to make this work. If you're under horsepowered, you can actually bog this thing down when you're trying to feed material through it. Now, you can make up for that by taking little passes and little passes and little passes. But the other thing is just the diameter of it might not fit some router tables. In fact, this completely maxes out my setup over there. So easier to use, might take more specific equipment than you actually have. The way you would use this one is just have that spin in the router table, have your panel flat up against it and push it through, and you'd form the profile in this face with this flat down on the table, and it's really easy to do. This one, smaller diameter, lighter weight, doesn't take as big of a table, doesn't take as much horsepower to make it work. But the setup is a little bit more difficult because it's a vertical panel bit. You truly run your panel vertically across it. So you'd have to set this up against your fence and push it past that bit. And the tendency is for this to want to tip back and forth. So you have to do a little bit more setup to keep this thing straight up and down. But since I have two different size doors and I have two different bits, I'm going to demonstrate the traditional on one set of doors and the vertical on the other set of doors, and then you can kind of see for yourself how they work and what you might want to do.
Once again, with the traditional or horizontal bit, you want the bearing flush with the fence. If your router has a variable speed, turn it all the way down. In general, the bigger the bit, the slower you want it turning. As for depth, if you have enough horsepower, you can go straight to the finish line and just take it really slow. If you're underpowered, start shallow and raise the bit over a few passes. I got the profile I wanted in one pass, but my punky maple was so soft that I ended up with a lot of end grain tear out. So I bumped the bit up just a little more and made a second finishing pass to clean things up. With the vertical bit, you have to take a few more things into consideration. If you're going this route, we can assume you have a smaller table and less horsepower, which means you're going to make your profile in multiple passes. On your first pass, you're fairly stable, but as soon as you start removing material, you introduce a lot more opportunity to wobble around on that edge. Getting your featherboards up higher off the table and pushing towards the top of the fence will make things much easier and safer. I cut long holes into both ends of a homemade 2x10 and attached a length of T-track along one edge of it. This allowed me to attach the board to the T-track in my tabletop and mount my featherboards up high. Just remember to flip the hardware in the featherboards so they're applying pressure in the right direction. With the featherboards up high like this, it keeps the flat part of the panel pressed up against the fence. Each time we move the fence back to cut a little deeper, I can just move the big board a little closer instead of adjusting each featherboard independently. With every single part of this process, no matter which method you're using, setup is everything. Take the time up front to get your equipment dialed in correctly, then the actual shaping process is very safe and takes almost no time at all. Take some time to sand the contours of the panel now, because it'll get trickier to do after the glue up. The glue up itself is simple. Just put a little glue on the ends of the rails and fit the pieces of your puzzle together. A couple of clamps help pull the joints together, then clean up any squeeze out with a wet rag.
Alright guys, that is how you make a raised panel door. Now, I'm not putting finish on these today because the whole project isn't done yet, so I'm going to save that until everything's ready to go and do it all at once. Now there's a few other things I want to address before we cut off here. Material thickness. Every raised panel door that I've seen is 3/4 of an inch thick, which is good because that's what most materials are going to come in. One thing to keep in mind though is that with the bits that I have here, when I have the front profile looking exactly the way I want it to, this was actually a little bit too thick to fit into my groove still. So you have a couple options there. I ended up just running mine upside down through my drum sander to actually make the middle material thinner. You could start with thinner material and not have to do that last step, which knowing this going forward is probably how I would do it. The other thing you can do is actually run this just barely against the edge on your table saw until you've taken it at a depth of the same depth as your groove, at just enough to get it to fit on side there. So if you look at this side, I can't get it to fit, but I ran that over the table saw blade and now it does fit, and you can't even tell from the back, which you're never going to see anyway. So keep that in mind. You might have to play with the thickness of your panel depending on what kind of bits you have. Now this horizontal, this more traditional style bit, there is one more version of it that actually has a top blade so that as it's going through and cutting your profile on your panel, it's cutting to the very edge to that exact thickness that you need to fit inside your groove. With that being said, you only have one shot. You can't adjust different depths because you will mess with that final thickness, so you have to do it all at the final thickness right from the start. One other thing that's worth noting is that because your stiles are the exact overall height of your door, you wouldn't have to cut these to length ahead of time. You could leave these a little long, you could leave them a lot long, and after you've glued it together, you could run this through your table saw and get it absolutely flush with that rail. I've seen it done, it works just fine. I like to cut them first, knowing that this is my correct height, knowing that I'm gonna have a perfect 90 on all of these, and when I'm gluing it together, if I make sure that the edge is absolutely flush with the ends of my stiles, then I know that this is going to be square, or at least close enough to square. That's probably about all I need to point out here. Huge thank you to Rockler for helping me put out this video. They gave me all the stuff that I needed to demonstrate to you guys how to make these doors. So if you are thinking about making raised panel doors, you should definitely go to their website and search around for the kind of stuff that they have. They have everything you could possibly need to get one of these built.
most of what I have came directly from Rockler. So thank you to Rockler. Thank you guys for watching, and check back next time when I actually do the piece of furniture that these doors are going on. We'll see you then.